Hello students. In this lecture I am going to discuss about the problems of deadlocks and the various possible solutions that are available for handling deadlocks. And in fact this topic is just a continuation of our previous discussion, which was on concurrency and synchronization. Just like the problems of the other problems of concurrency, deadlock is also a problem that is happening because of the concurrent processing. When you are trying to execute many processes simultaneously, it may even lead to a deadlock. But the reason that we are going to separately discuss separately discuss deadlock as a problem is that the solutions we discussed so far doesn't work for deadlocks. Namely, mutual exclusion was identified as a solution when it comes to problems like race condition or data inconsistency. But mutual exclusion doesn't work as a solution in handling deadlock. So we have to find some other solution for the problem, for tackling the deadlock problem. And that is exactly what we are going to discuss in this particular discussion. Before I actually take you to the operating system side of deadlock and examples from the actual operating system, I just want you to get some basic idea of deadlock from this scene that is from a film. In this particular scene, what you have to observe is that both actors are holding guns against each other, and I'm considering this situation as a kind of deadlock. And in fact, literally, this is a deadlock because they are likely to fall dead if they trigger the gun. And otherwise, the reason I'm considering this as a deadlock is that because both are pointing the gun at the other person, neither person will not dare to drop their gun, because they will have they will have a fear in their mind that when I drop the gun, what if the other person triggers the gun, which means that they will be just holding the gun forever, so without making any decision. So it's a kind of deadlock. And what actually caused this situation is that the resources which are available here. So because there are two resources, or in fact, or in other words, there are two guns available. That is what the basic cause of this problem. Imagine the same situation in which only one person is having a gun. In that case, he will simply shoot the other guy and will move away, or he will just drop the gun and will leave the situation. So deadlock situation would not have happened if there was just one resource. And what we have to understand from this example is that a deadlock will happen when there are minimum two resources involved in the conflict. If there is just one resource, it won't have any kind of deadlock situation. Now we are going to discuss about the operating system side of the deadlock. In an operating system, what really causes a deadlock is number one, concurrent processes. So we are not going to run one process at a time. We will be executing many processes at a time. That is the primary reason for the potential problem of deadlock. And number two, there are finite number of resources. So the number of resources are generally inadequate. So when many processes demand resources, we cannot fulfill the demands of all the processes. So in such situation, a deadlock would happen in a particular resource conflict. For example, there is process 1 which is in need of resource 1 and resource 2. It initially gets resource 1, but it is unable to get resource 2 because the resource 2 is already occupied by some other process. And the moment a resource demanded by a process is not available, that process will be blocked. So it will be blocked into the queue of that particular resource. So the situation of process 1 is that it is holding resource 1, but due to unavailability of resource 2, it's being blocked. Now coming to the other process called process 2. Process 2 is also need of the same resources, but it needs them in the different order. So process 2 first needs resource 2 and then followed by resource 1. And it made the request for resource 2 initially and also got it successfully, but it is not able to get the resource 1 because resource 1 is being held by the first process. So this will also be blocked. Now the situation is that both process has been blocked because they were in need of resources that is held by the other process. This situation is called as a deadlock, and these two processes will never be able to progress from this condition unless the OS recognizes that there is a deadlock and does something to get them out of the situation. They will be permanently blocked. Now the system model. A system consists of finite number of resources to be distributed among number of competing processes, and the resources may be of different types and instances. So types of resources is like it could be a hardware resource or it could be a software resource. For example, a CPU, IO devices, these are all some of the hardware or resources, or even a printer. And it may also involve the deadlock may also involve some software resources like files, messages, signals. Those are all hardware resources. So a deadlock could happen due to any of the resources, or even combination of these two resources may lead to a deadlock. Another very important factor in dealing with the deadlock is we have to consider the number of instances of the resources available. When there is just one resource available, then there is a possibility of much higher possibility of deadlock. But if there are more than one instances of a resource available, then the chances of the resource of the deadlock is lower. So we have to carefully look at the number of instances to determine whether there is a deadlock or not. For example, if there are two printers available and two processes simultaneously are in need of the same printer, if they still will be able to get it without any deadlock or any conflict, because there are two instances available. On the other hand, if there is just one printer, then we can consider that there is a better chance of the processes getting into a deadlock. And there is also one more assumption, that when you say that there are two instances of resources available, we assume that both resources are identical, which means that if a process is asking for a particular resource, it will be satisfied with any one of the instances. It won't be particular about one particular instance. If it is not if the process needs a particular instance of the resource, then we can have to treat it as they are not actually identical. They are two different resources. So when there are instances, which means that they are identical. That is our basic assumption in this problem. And also we also assume that no process will demand resources which exceeds the maximum number of resources available. So if there are only 5 resources of a particular category available, no process will demand 6 resources at a time. That is a kind of illegal request. So the OS will immediately, because it can never be fulfilled by the operating system. So such a request will be terminated as a trap. It will be treated as a violation. So the process will be killed by the operating system. Now, given that a process is getting a resource, the usage of the resource will happen in this particular sequence. First, the process will make a request for the resource. Secondly, it will, in case if it successfully gets the resource, then it will start to operate the resource for its purpose. And thirdly, once the usage of the resource is over, it will release the resource. So this is the sequence in which the resource utilization will take place. And a lot of times the resource request will need system calls. So whenever there is an IO resource needed, it will typically be a system call, like a printf, scanf, or even an open file, close file, memory allocation, memory free. So all this will be resulting in triggering system calls where the OS will facilitate the operation. And if it happens to be semaphore usage, then we are familiar with the two methods called wait and signal. Internally, the operating system will maintain a table. So the table will record all the resources available in that particular system, and which resources are already allocated and which resources are available, how many instances are available, and which processes are currently using the resource. So it will maintain a complete history of all the resources, which is called as a system table. And besides the system table, it will also maintain various queues for each resources, so that whenever a particular resource is not available, and if a process asks for that, that process will be enrolled into that particular queue, and it will be waiting for its turn to use the resource. So there will be a queue maintained for that. As I already pointed out, the resources can be classified into two types: physical resources and logical resources. And consider that the resource conflict or deadlock need not only happen with the other resources, it may even happen with messages. For example, I have the next example. See here, what you see is that process A is expecting a message from process B. So it is invoking a receive call. At the same time, process B is expecting a resource from process A, which means both will be expecting a message from the other, and neither will send the message to the other. So they will be permanently waiting for a message from each other, and it is called as a deadlock. Now we are going to categorize the deadlock by identifying the conditions for a deadlock. This is very important point. A deadlock will not happen in any situation. It will happen only in a certain situation where the necessary conditions for deadlock are present. So only if these conditions are existing, then we have to consider that there is a possibility of a deadlock. The first condition for deadlock to occur is that mutual exclusion. So when you have enforced the mutual exclusion on a resource, that means that you are treating that as a non-shareable resource. So only one process can use it at a time. The moment mutual exclusion is enforced either with semaphore or monitor or mutex or something else, some method, it brings the first possibility of brings the reason for deadlock is presented, and the second reason for a deadlock is hold and wait. In this situation, a process holding one resource is waiting for another resource. That is hold and wait. So if two processes are in a similar situation where one process is holding, both processes holding their first resource and both are waiting for their second resources, then there is a chance for a deadlock. So hold and wait is the second condition to be available for a deadlock to happen. Now the third condition is no preemption, which means that if a resource has been allocated to a process, and if that process is unable to use it because it gets blocked, still the resource cannot be revoked from the process. So there is preemption is not available for taking back that resource until it voluntarily hands over the resource. It's not possible. So then the third condition that is needed for a deadlock is no preemption. And the last and the most important condition is a circular wait. So in a circular wait, the processes are waiting for each other in a cyclic order. So the significance of the fourth condition is that all the other three conditions, namely mutual exclusion, hold and wait, and no preemption, they only bring the possibility of a deadlock. But when the fourth condition joins the other three conditions, it is actually a occurrence of or a presence of a deadlock. So the fourth condition confirms the deadlock. So the fourth condition is actually circular wait is very important for finding out whether there is a deadlock or not. So what is the important point to be remembered is that we are not saying that deadlock will happen if some of the conditions are one of the conditions are present. Okay, deadlock will happen only if all the four conditions hold true. Even if one condition fails, then there won't be a deadlock. For example, if there is no preemption, if there is preemption, then there won't be deadlock. And if there is no hold and wait, then there won't be a deadlock. So if at all deadlock has to happen, then all the four conditions must happen together. Only then there is going to be a deadlock. So before we actually get into the real solution for the deadlock, there is a useful tool called the resource allocation graph, which will help us to recognize the possibility as well as the presence of a deadlock. So we can draw a graph, and based on the graph we can determine whether there is a deadlock present in the given situation. By analyzing the graph, we can determine that. So how do you say that a given graph indicates a deadlock is, if you could find a cycle in the graph, then it is there is a chance of a deadlock. So the presence of a cycle is an indication of either a possibility of deadlock or a presence of deadlock. But if there is no cycle found in the graph, then there is no chance of a deadlock and there is no deadlock at all. That is how we can use this graph for identifying whether there is a possible deadlock or not. So we will see some example on how we can say from a given graph whether there is a deadlock or not. But we just have to get some basic idea about the this particular graph. So the graph will have two kind of directions, arrows. One is an arrow from process to resource. So an arrow from process to resource, it means that the process is in need of the resource. It is requesting for the resource, but it has not been granted till now. Whereas the arrow from resource to process indicates that this resource is currently occupied by or currently used by process, that particular process. So we will be see, when you see a graph, you should be able to differentiate the meaning of the resource and the process association based on the graph direction. It either means process is used by resource when a process is using the resource, or it means process is requesting a resource. Now look at this graph. Check whether there is a cycle. So first thing is what we infer from this graph is that resource 2 is available in two instances. So because there are two dots here, we can clearly see that this particular resource is available in two instances. Point number 1. Number 2, there is an arrow from R2 to P1, which means resource 2 is currently being occupied or being used by P1. So P1 is holding resource R2. And there is an arrow from R2 to P2, which means the second instance of the same resource is currently held by process 2. Now there is also an arrow from P1 to R1, meaning that P1 is waiting for R1 and R1 is actually held by P2. And similarly, P2 is demanding R3, which is being held by P3. What is the question now is that whether we can say there is a deadlock in this from this graph. The answer is no, because there is no cycle. So if you start from R2 to P1 and P1 to R1, R1 to P2, P2 to R3, we will end with the P3. We will not come back to R2. So cycle will be there only if you are able to start from a point and making a circle, you are also able to reach the same point. But that is not actually available in this given example. That is the reason is that P3 is independent. So P3 is not in conflict with the other two processes. It is just needing R3 and it is also using R3, which means at any point of time it will release R3 and that resource will then become available to P2 and P2 will get both resources it is in need of, and so it will give up R1 and R1 will then go to P1. So gradually all the three processes will complete successfully. So for the verdict here is that there is no deadlock present in the given graph. But here you can see that the second example is slightly modified just to include a arrow from P3 to R2. Now it becomes a cycle. So because there is a cyclic connection from R2 to P1, P1 to R2, P2 to R3, and then P3 to R2. So there is a cycle present, and now it is a case of possible deadlock. Now the next example is, so in this example also we just have to observe the example and check whether there is a cycle. Actually there is a cycle between P2 and P1 and P3. So we can see here that R2 is being held by P1, and P1 is waiting for R1, and that R1 is being held by P3. So there is a cycle between P1 and R3. But this is not an example of deadlock. That is because there are more than one instances of that resource. So the other resource instances of the resources are used by two other processors. In this case, P2 is making use of R1 and P4 is making use of R2. So at any moment they will complete their usage, and that instance of the resource will become available to either P1 or P3. So they will not be caught in a deadlock. So this is an example where even if there is a cycle, we can't conclude that there is a deadlock, because there are more than one instance of the resource available. It was not getting into a deadlock. So that is the end of this lecture. So next lecture we will discuss about the possible solutions for tackling deadlock. Thank you.